And we move on to the next item on the agenda, which is item 2.2, which is residential development with open space, landscaping, drainage and associated infrastructure at Scone North, Scone. And I would remind members that this is an in-principle application. This is a major application and it is in principle. I would like to invite Mr. Petrie to introduce the item with some stills and if he has any updates for the committee.
Thank you very much, Convener. As a way of update at the beginning, similar to the previous item, it's appropriate to correctly recommend an update to proposed condition 1 on page 102 should correctly refer to the 2013 Development Management Regulations and not that of the 2008 regulations. Moving on to the slides. Application 1602-127 IPM relates to the Local Development Plan Housing Site Allocation H29, which through this submission now seeks to formally establish in principle planning consent. The site, which is also referred to as Scone North, is located on the northern boundaries of Scone, as can be seen quite clearly within the red sightline boundary on the aerial image on the slide. From the aerial itself, you can see surrounding land use features, including the tree belts to the west and the north, and the wider predominant agricultural nature of the site, with the existing residential dwellings to the south. Moving on to slide 2. This shows the illustrative master plan, which was submitted as part of the submission, which identifies a proposed road network, open spaces, and also an indicative situation for the Cross-Tay Link Road. It has been identified that the initial construction and residential development will be accessed off Stormont Road, which you can see in this slide here with beech trees in the foreground and commercial plantation in the background. Moving into the site itself, looking south, this is adjacent to, looking at Harper Way, which is adjacent to the proposed entrance, can see seen here, and also the remainder of the site at this point. Now intend to just give a better site context and an overview to let several slides just run through to give an appreciation of the overall site context and its characteristics, moving from west to east, including the lower points of the initial phases and then higher up on the northern western extents, looking back down across Scone and beyond to Perth, and then also looking a panoramic view up and across from Highfield Road at the track, which is part of Core Path SCON 12 and right of way 39/12. Looking up the track of the core path, this landscape section provides a natural established landscape divide between the development phases, with minimal vehicular access proposed to cut across this section of tree belt. The last few slides show the land within the identified latter phases of development, including the approximate position of the Cross-Tay Link Road, which is shown almost in that dip, just be cutting across that dipped area in the field, and the tree cover backdrop of the northeastern extents of the site above the A94 as viewed from New Main Steading, and then finally dropping down onto the A94 itself, viewing west from the A94 and towards Scone with the site in the foreground. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have deputations with this application, and can I ask Ms. Belch from Scone North Study Group, who's an objector, to come forward, please. Thank you. You have 5 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have some questions.
Thank you. My name is Jo Bausch, and I am a professor of cardiovascular medicine and consultant physician at Nine Wells Hospital. I speak today on behalf of the North Scone Study Group, who organised the Scone Village questionnaire that took place about 9 months ago. This questionnaire was replied to by 50% of the village, 98% of whom opposed this development, and we believe for good reason. There are a number of issues of concern that we have about this proposal, and my colleague from the SDCC will talk to you about these. But I myself would like to focus on the air pollution and how it affects the people that you, the Council, are dedicated to protect. The Council's own website quotes the UK Environmental Protection Act of 1990, which says that the Council has the responsibility to its constituents to deal with environmental risk to their health from noxious substances. In other words, the Council is required by law to protect us from air pollution. Secondly, the World Health Organization says that anything over 40 annual mean of nitric oxide gases, extremely poisonous gases, should never be tolerated. Under the EU Air Quality Directive, the legal limit of these gases is 32. Ganachie and Bridgend have been above 40 for the past 6 years, and recent measures over 5 months in Scone are also well above this legal limit. This is in contrast to the single measure in the application tested during the school holidays in August, when we all know that traffic is greatly reduced. The Bridgend Ganachie Canoe Community Council have endorsed this concern and asked me to tell you that I speak on their behalf about this today also. If an air quality assessment had been requested, the levels reported would have precluded any approval. Mr. Bryan is quoted in the newspapers as saying the increase in traffic caused by the first 100 houses would be approximately 3% less than the 5% threshold. And he also says an independent air quality assessment carried out by the Community Council was not applicable because it was based on English guidelines. Please first note, as already stressed, this is an application in principle for 700 houses, not 100. The 5% threshold comes from the Environmental Protection UK, EP UK 2010 guidance, and the so-called English guidelines are from EP UK's 2015 updated guidance, which is endorsed by the Scottish Government Air Quality Guidelines in March 2016. The Planning Department scoped out the requirement for an AQA in July 2016. That is after these dates, and thus these regulations should have been used, as our environmental audit did. There are brownfield developments, such as in the Glebe of 60 houses already in the pipeline, and we've just heard about the commercial traffic that will now be going up to the airport. Each of these tend to come to you with a negligible effect of air quality. But until today, I have not heard this cumulative effect being mentioned. It's certainly not mentioned in the application. The director of the Royal Town Planning Institute has said that failure to take cumulative effects into account is a serious concern. Guidance was issued to all planning departments in Scotland in January this year. The consultation was extended in February to allow the developer to scope beaver activity, a law not yet in effect, yet there was no mention of this regulation already in effect. Any increase in traffic will increase pollution, as the Director of Public Health NHS Tayside has said in his comments, saying that this development should not go ahead.
You have 1 minute left, ma'am.
Thank you. I will not take more time. This will damage our newborn babies' brains, causing autism, low IQ. Babies are more likely to die in their first year of life. Pollution can be worse than passive smoking. Would you let your children sit in a car where someone smokes cigarettes every day on the way to school? That's what this development will do. Our elderly will have dementia, and all of us will have more heart attacks, strokes and cancers than those of you who do not live in Scone, Bridgend or sit in its traffic. We ask you to refuse this application. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have we any questions for Ms. Mills? Councillor Coates.
Councillor Coates, you state that the pollution levels were measured in August, and you also state that the traffic levels in August are far lower than at other times of the year. Wouldn't you say that in Perthshire the traffic levels in August are far higher due to the tourism traffic?
If you look at the council's own traffic measures, you'll see that during the school holidays, they are significantly lower, especially in terms of queuing traffic at Bridge End, and as those of us who live in Scone, sometimes tailing back to the beginning of Scone.
Thank you. Any further questions? Councillor Wilson.
Professor Belch, hello. You spent a lot of your presentation dealing with pollution, air pollution at Bridge End. And in reading all of the report and all of the conditions, and also the potential for phasing the development and the link in with the completion of the link road, do any of these points ameliorate any of your concerns?
In the contrary, the conditions are that the road will be commissioned. We have been unable to obtain from the planning, and I don't blame them, I think the information is not there, about how long it will take to get funding for this road. Further, we talk about it being 2022, 2023, but that's just the first part. But we're concerned about the bit coming up over us. And if that road is not complete, all these houses that are planned when it is so-called commissioned will be built and be contributing to the pollution. And if there is an unavoidable delay for whatever reason to completing this road, the building will still go ahead because of this word commissioned as opposed to constructed. And so we have always argued that the draft LDP, which said that no building can go ahead until the bridge is constructed, should actually be adhered to and not the more recent definitions.
Okay, I don't want to be over pedantic, but I think the word committed rather than commissioned convener is
committed, I beg your
yeah.
pardon.
Can I just press you on the point about phasing, because within the conditions there's a phasing of 100 units at the Stormont Road end of the site first, and then it's within the gift of this committee to decide what any other conditions would be in terms of phasing. There'll no be discussion on that. Leaving aside the 100 houses, which I understand is a contentious enough issue, if these conditions were linked to completion of the link road rather than it being committed, what would your reaction be to that?
Well, as a doctor, my main concern is the pollution, and we have always said bridge first, infrastructure first. As you may be aware, there's a white paper which is actually called Infrastructure First that has already been passed by your government. It's currently being debated and is likely to come into law before the end of this year. And what this law says is infrastructure first. And this application would be unlikely to get through if it were submitted when this law was in force.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have we any further questions? Thank you very much, Professor Belch. We'll now move on to the second deputation, which is Mr. Kerricher, again on behalf of Scone District Community Council. Again, you have 5 minutes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll change my speech to start with good afternoon rather than good morning. I'm Donald McKerricher, retired Fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers, and been asked to address you on behalf of Scone Community Council. We protest most strongly that the report from the Interim Head of Planning recommends approval of this application. This approval is largely based on the premise that the application complies with the LDP 2014, a statement which is blatantly untrue. Over the past 20 years, there's been increasing concern about the noticeable increase in traffic congestion and related air quality issues in and around Perth. These concerns were taken into consideration when the formulation of the adopted local plan was taking place. As such, I would refer you, in fact, to the LDP, page 141, which refers specifically to Scone. Again, it states, to prevent the reduction in air quality and increased congestion in the Bridge End area of Perth, there will be an embargo on further planning consents for housing of sites of 10 or more until such time as the construction of the Cross Tay Link Road is a committed project. The first point I'd take from the previous discussions on the other application is this 10 is not to become a cumulative thing. The intention was 10 or more in total was required this embargo to be in place. Now, what you have before you today is an application for consent. Now, it's obvious from the previous speeches and also from the actions of the Council that the Cross Tay Link Road is not a committed project. Therefore, there's no dubiety that the officer was totally incorrect in recommending that this application was in accordance with the LDP. As such, the officer's recommendation for approval is based on a totally false premise and therefore must be rejected. The application is inadequate in the provision of information for public scrutiny, and some of the detail which has been provided is incorrect. These shortfalls in numerous areas of application have been highlighted in our response submitted to the Council. We have our detailed objection, together with that of our own independent consultant, has been appended, in fact, to your report. From these objections, you can see there's an amount of detail which is totally lacking. And our detailed objections, together with those from another 900 parties, have, however, been slightly recognised by the officers in their consideration of the submission. But they have not taken no account of things that we consider are very great detail. They have accepted, for example, that although the developer is supposed to produce a flooding plan for submission with any application in accordance with the supplementary guidance of this Council, what we've actually had is a level 1 flood risk assessment carried out by the consultants on the basis of a desktop survey. Now, a competent submission should involve detailed site investigation together with a full geological and hydrological assessment. Scone has suffered in the past some flooding, and this is why it formed part of the conditions stated in the LDP. Therefore, our concern is also that this information, had it been provided, would have been submitted to the Perth and Kinross flooding team. Now, we have received previous correspondence from the flooding team that they have insufficient records of the Scone drainage. So how they could approve a scheme in any case is a secondary consideration. However, the other problem we have is that the officers have, rather than trying to make sure that there's a clear information provided at this stage, have opted to propose 36 planning conditions in an effort to obtain the outstanding information at some future date.
You have 1 minute, sir.
Such a procedure allows the developer to respond directly with the planning officers without any need to make the general public aware of such details. This is a very devious practice and should not be permitted by this committee. The correct route to progress such a major application would be submission of a competent application with sufficient information to allow an informed decision to be made by the public as well as by the officers. We request, therefore, that as the information is totally inadequate, this committee refuse this application and prevent any such devious arrangement being put in place. Thank you for the opportunity of addressing you, and I trust that these comments, together with our detailed submission, will be taken into account in your consideration of this application. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carragher. I would add that I really don't appreciate your use of the word devious when referring to any member of staff in the Council. I think it's totally inappropriate. Have we any questions for Mr. Carragher? No, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Simpson. You have 5 minutes,
You'll be delighted to
if
know.
required.
Thank you. You'll be delighted to know I won't require 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Convener, for the opportunity to address this meeting of the Development Management Committee. It is neither my place nor my intention to lecture this committee or to tell you what to do. When I've spoken at previous meetings, I've always prefaced my remarks by saying that I know you'll all be familiar with the application, having had ample opportunity to study the papers and the site. I cannot, in all honesty, use this introduction today because, as you know, the application itself ran to nearly 4,000 pages and there are over 900 objections to be considered and there has been no site visit. it will not have escaped your notice that this proposed application has been extremely contentious over many years and was a hot topic on almost every Scone doorstep during the local election campaign, as Councillor Stewart and Sarwar and I well know. The two very well attended public information events held in Scone by the applicant did not appear to alleviate these concerns. Previous well-prepared speakers for the objectors have highlighted a number of these and raised many unanswered points, and I have no wish to repeat these now. I would, however, suggest that the area covered by this application really requires an extensive site visit in order to fully appreciate its scale and to see for yourselves the woodland and countryside involved. I would be happy to host such a visit, Convener, if that would be helpful. Scone community groups have appealed to national and local politicians of all parties for assistance in highlighting their concerns. But apparently we're expected to believe that there is now nothing to be done but to determine this application today, less than 3 weeks since the local elections and less than a week since the appointment of this committee. You will be aware that the public perception of this timescale is not supportive. An avenue that has not been explored is that of appealing directly to the developer, and I should like to take this opportunity to ask A&J Stevens to withdraw this deeply unpopular application, at least until such time as the Cross Tay Link Road and other infrastructure is actually in place. Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you very much, Councillor Simpson. Have we any questions for Councillor Simpson at this point? Councillor Wilson.
I asked Professor Belch this question, so I'll ask you it, Councillor Simpson. I understand the concerns, but given where we are now, would the introduction of all of the conditions that are outlined in the report, which are extensive, and also the potential this committee has to introduce a further condition about the phasing of the construction of the residential units, how far would that go to ameliorate your own concerns?
As far as I can do nothing for our concerns. Those of you who are more observant will notice that I cycle regularly to and from Scone and Perth and know firsthand the extent of the congestion and the air quality. We cannot be expected to believe that small developments have no cumulative effect. We're already building houses in Birch Avenue in Scone, we've already built some houses in the Army Play Park in Scone, and we are now proposing to build houses in the former Glebe School. None of these can be taken in isolation, and there must be a cumulative effect, and there has to come a point where we say there could be no more without affecting the air quality.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Councillor Barnacle.
Lewis, I would like to ask you about the process that led to this site being included in the LDP, because it's always difficult to take into account large-scale objection to a site that's allocated in an LDP. Was there a lot of objection from the community to the concept of this site being in the LDP at the time of that process?
Thank you for that, Councillor Barnacle. I think the difficulty with giving a direct answer depends upon what it was we were consulted upon. It is the contention of the community that they were consulted on whether or not the Cross Tay Link Road would be a constructed project. After they were consulted using that wording, it then turned out it wasn't in fact to be a constructed project at all, but to be a committed project, and they then took a number of years to find out what committed project meant. So I think in some respects any people who had objections thought that these houses would only come after the Cross Tay Road Link was a constructed project, and it's been the confusion over that wording that caused so much of a local ill feeling.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? No. Thank you very much, Councillor Simpson.
Thank you, Convener.
And we now have Councillor Stewart, who's also a local member. And Councillor Stewart, you also have 5 minutes, and then questions if required.
Thank you, Convener, for the opportunity to address the committee today in regard to the Scone North planning application. Having spoken to literally hundreds of Scone residents in recent months, I can assure the committee that this is the #1 topic of concern within the village. As a local councillor for Scone, I've had the opportunity to immerse myself in researching and understanding the details of the issue at hand over past months. And you've heard deputations from the community, Professor Belch representing concerns on air quality and Mr McKercher representing flooding concerns as well. I'd like to constrain my remarks to concerns which have risen through my own researches and investigations. The contention is that the application itself is compliant with the local development plan. Now, while the application might meet the site-specific requirements on page 142 of the local development plan, I would contend that it doesn't meet the general requirements under either 532.2 or 532.3 on the immediately preceding page of the plan. 532.2 is a spatial strategy consideration which says that a strategic housing site has been identified on the north side of the settlement, i.e. Scone. However, the cross-tail link road is required before development can proceed. It might be contended that a smaller number of houses is allowed to permit, could be permitted before the cross-tail link road is in place. However, you can take the next sentence, the former Glebe School is also identified for housing, but as this is an infill site, development can proceed in advance of the cross-tail link road. So there's a specific exclusion for one site, but not for another under 532.2. Under 532.3, infrastructure considerations, there is to be an embargo on further planning consents for housing for sites of 10 or more until such time as the construction of the cross-tail link road is a committed project, and the embargo would not apply to brownfield sites, but the definition of brownfield site does not include the Scone North site. I'd also question whether the LDP, the local development plan, Councillor James, and whether the application is compliant with policies NE2, NE3, NE4, EP2 and EP11 on pages 41, 42, 45 and 41, 42, 51 and 58 of TAPLAN, with which the local development plan itself has to be compliant. Further, I am the new convener of the Environment, Enterprise and Infrastructure Committee for Perth and Kinross Council. I have been in post for approximately 166 hours, and I would like to take an opportunity to review at a strategic level and from a holistic point of view the infrastructure requirements necessary to support a development of this size, and to see whether the Council can deliver infrastructure improvements in advance of such a major new housing development, just as is currently happening at Bertha Park. In short, I believe that this is the wrong development, in the wrong place and at the wrong time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Stewart. Have we any questions? Councillor Wilson, thank you.
Just on the grounds of consistency, I'll ask Councillor Stewart the same question as I asked Professor Belch and Councillor Simpson. Understand the concerns. Would the introduction of a condition by this committee about phasing help ameliorate your concerns?
I think that the appropriate phasing is to look at whether the infrastructure necessary for a development of this size can be provided before the development is consented. That's my take on the appropriate phasing for both infrastructure and individual applications.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Councillor Stewart. No further questions. I'll now ask Mr. Stephen to come forward. Mr. Stephen will speak in support of the application. And again, Mr. Stephen, you have 5 minutes when you're ready.
Excuse me. Good afternoon. My name is John Stephen. I'm the Managing Director of A&J Stephen Limited. I would like to thank the convener for giving me the opportunity to address the committee this morning. And like Lewis, I do not intend to lecture you this afternoon. Before talking about the application, I thought it important to mention a little about the company. We're a third-generation family business founded in 1935. Since then, we have built thousands of homes all over Scotland, but our base has always remained in Perth. Over the decades, we have trained hundreds of tradesmen, many of whom form the backbone of the countless small trades companies in the area. Only last week, one of our young joinery apprentices won Scottish Apprentice of the Year. We currently directly employ 84 people and support a similar number of subcontractors, and as such, we are a significant contributor to the local economy. My reason in mentioning this is to highlight the economic benefits associated with having a local company bring forward housing sites in Perth and Kinross, as opposed to those sites currently being developed by national house builders. Turning to the application itself, I think it is relevant to remember that the reason we are here today is that the site is in the development plan. As the committee will appreciate, the development plan consists of two documents, TAE Plan and the Perth and Kinross Local Development Plan. Both of these documents were prepared over many years by professional planners before being subjected to examination by Scottish ministers and then for adoption by the Council. TAE Plan was adopted in 2012 and classified Scone as a Tier 1 settlement, and as such had the effect of earmarking Scone for significant expansion. The Local Development Plan was adopted in 2014 and allocated that expansion to the land that is the subject of this application. Following adoption of the Local Development Plan, we began the work of preparing a planning application for that land at Scone North. Our planning application also involved the preparation of an environmental impact assessment, which places a higher degree of environmental scrutiny on the proposal than would normally be the case. Your consideration of this application is the culmination of a planning process that has taken many years. We have responded to the need for housing, a need set out by the Scottish Government, its agencies and Perth and Kinross Council. I do not believe we should be criticised, as we have been, for bringing forward a proposal that both national government and local government have determined is necessary. We are a local company seeking to deliver much needed housing and employment. I have been coming to these committees since 1990, 27 years ago, and I have never felt the need to speak before today. But this application is vitally important to the company and its workforce. The Planning Department have now assessed this application and have come to the conclusion that it should be approved. If this application is approved today, the first houses are likely to be completed towards the end of 2018. The 100th house is unlikely to be occupied until sometime after 2021. There will not be a sudden increase in traffic levels as a result of this consent being granted, despite assertions to the contrary from others who have spoken. The objectors have led a vigorous campaign in an attempt to block the application, but that does not make their arguments correct or even valid. Only one statutory consultee objected to this application, the Community Council. Not one of the others objected, including SEPA, Scottish Water, Transport Scotland, the RSPB, Scottish Natural Heritage, Perth and Kinross Heritage Trust, the Forestry Commission and Historic Environment Scotland. Crucially, and this is fundamental to the decision you must make today, not only does the application conform to both TAE Plan and the Local Development Plan, but also not one of these independent professional bodies can find a reason to object to the application. I respectfully request, therefore, that you make the correct planning decision and approve the application. Thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for your deputation, Mr. Stephen. Are there any questions? Councillor Wilson.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. You've been here during the whole day, sir, so you'll know the anxieties about knowledge of the site and experience that have been expressed already. If the committee are minded to determine this application today, what would your view be of a deferral to allow a site visit by members of the committee with a reconvened meeting in early course?
As I mentioned in my presentation, this application is vital to the company. The statutory period for consideration of the application is over. If we do not get a decision today, unfortunately we'll be left with no alternative but to appeal the application. It's too important, there's jobs at stake. We have 9 sites on the go at the moment. We have 3 left by the end of the year. 2 of those are not in Perth and Kinross. You can draw your own conclusions.
So just to clarify, if the committee do not determine the application today, you would be minded to set the appeal process of non-determination in progress?
Within the week.
Convener, I don't know if that's a challenge or a threat, but I'll leave that to
It's
one.
a clarification.
Ask the question. In relation to the point you made about phasing of the first 100 houses, right? Would you like to repeat the time scale of the likely construction?
Certainly. Obviously these are estimates because our build rates depend on the market at that time. But if we look at a timescale and assume that the application is consented today, it's an application in principle, we will have to follow it up with a detailed application. And that will be at least 6 months before it's consented, at least. We then have to apply for roads construction consent, technical proof for sewers, and all the other statutory consents that we require. Excuse me. So it will be many months before we start on site, even after we get the detailed consent. We then have to service the site, then we start the house construction. So our estimate at this stage is that first houses would be occupied towards the end of 2018. And if you assume a build rate of around 25 houses per annum, and bearing in mind that our current site at Bulgarvey has sustained a build rate of around 17 units per annum, so I think 25 is optimistic, shall we say, particularly in the current climate. So the 100 houses, the 100th house would not be occupied until sometime after 2021, probably, well, 2022 would be my best guess at this stage.
Okay. One more question, Convener? There are a lengthy number of conditions in the proposed consent. Are you, representing your company, willing to accept all of these conditions?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Are there any further questions? Councillor Anderson.
Thank you, Convener. Are you planning to continue building solely yourself on this site?
Certainly at the outset, the layout of the site is such that it would be very difficult to bring another developer on board, certainly within the first 100 units. Beyond that, it's possible, but it's not our intention at the moment.
So further down the line, there's a potential and maybe more than one developer working on that site at the same time?
Yes, it would be wrong of me to suggest otherwise, but all I can say is that the intention at the moment is that there would not be, but that could change.
Can I have another question?
Carry on,
There
Councillor
is
Anderson.
also been suggested here by SEPA that downstream, and we know there's been a problem for quite a number of years with the barrel drain, there's a potential for planning gain to address that. Would that be something that your company would be willing to engage in?
It's actually part of the proposal. Our drainage strategy for the site actually takes out part of the existing catchment of the barrel drain. SEPA and the Council's flooding officer are on record as saying that the development happening would actually improve the barrel drain situation. So it's actually a positive benefit to the barrel drain by the development happening, contrary to what Mr McCarricker was suggesting.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Anderson. Any further questions? Councillor Barnacle.
I'd just like to revisit Councillor Wilson's question because I'm struggling to understand why you feel that a delay for a site visit to inform local members and members of this committee more fully of the papers, the issues in the papers, why a delay which may only be probably a short to the next committee, why that is such an issue for you in the timescales we're talking about?
Okay, the application was submitted in December. We're already well beyond the 4-month target for an decision. So the implications of a delay to us are significant, and we cannot afford to take the risk that after the site meeting, you come back to this committee at a yet to be determined date, and that the application is refused. We can't take that risk.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Stephen, for your deputation.
Thank you.
Have there been any questions for officers at this point? Councillor Anderson.
Yes, perhaps some of the officers could tell me why it's taken so long to come, this plan has taken to come before us.
Mr. Bryan.
The application has gone beyond the statutory 4-month period for determination, which has already been highlighted, but I believe that was in early April, so we're not so far behind on that. The realities with the application of this nature and complexity, where the additional information has to be sought during the assessment of the application, then that has to be requested, and very often there's a requirement to re-notify and re-advertise on the back of additional information. So that tends to extend the timescale that it takes to deal with an application. So taking all of that into account, that's one of the principal reason why the application has gone beyond the 4-month period and is coming to committee today. But we took the view that as soon as all the information was available and all the necessary consultations and notifications had been carried out, then we would bring it to the first available committee, which is today.
Councillor Barnacle.
Councillor Stewart, in his presentation, suggested that he would like to, as in his new position as convener of E&I, that he'd like to review the status of this particular site within the LDP, possibly a review of that type of thing. Now, I would like to ask 2 questions. First of all, of forward planning, whether that is even feasible in the context of where we are with things. And the second point I would like to ask is, I don't see anywhere in this paper mention of prime agricultural land. It looks to me as though some of the land that is being built on is prime agricultural land, and would you confirm that building on prime agricultural land is contrary to national planning policy? Was this taken into account during the LDP process?
Thank you very much for your question. I'll maybe ask Mr. Marshall if he would like to respond.
The process of reviewing the local development plan is one that's set out in statute, and we're currently significantly along that process. We've published our main issues report, and it's proposed to bring the proposed plan before the council in the autumn of this year. To date, there has been no consultation on a proposal to remove site in Scone. Such a major consideration would require us to go back to and publish a main issues report, I believe, and review the strategic environmental assessment for the plan. That would introduce significant delays to the process, and we would fail to meet our statutory requirement to review the plan within a 5-year period. Now, I would need to look at a detailed timetable to try and establish that, but that would be my initial reaction to a proposal to review a strategic site within the plan. The second question about prime agricultural land, Scottish planning policy dictates that you should avoid, where possible, the use of prime agricultural land. One of the exclusions is where it's required to meet strategic allocations. So it's not an absolute prohibition of prime agricultural land being used. And indeed, in an area such as Perth, we are surrounded by good quality agricultural land of class 3, 2 and above. And it's a fairly major issue, one that is considered. It's considered through the strategic environmental assessment of the development plan. I'm not aware in particular percentage of this site that may be prime, but I think a fair bit of it is not prime land. Perhaps development management colleagues can confirm that.
Thank you for that, Mr. Marshall. I would just, yes, we do have to work within the local development plan. That site is zoned within the local development plan for housing, albeit it's enviably agricultural land at the moment, from my perspective. Do we have Bob Band, further questions? Thank you.
Thank you,
Councillor Band.
Convener. Two questions for Mr. Elliott. One, can he confirm that the definition of a committed project includes the wording work started on site? And the second point, can I ask Mr. Elliott what the situation is with land which has been in the local development plan and an in-principle application has come forward for that? What is the relationship between an in-principle application and an allocated site in the LDP?
Okay, thank you. Mr. Elliott.
Councillor Band, on your first question, the definition is contained within the papers, and I couldn't really add to that. The second question is, I'm not quite sure, you're talking about what's the relationship between the zoning and the IPM?
Yes. What is the situation if we were to refuse an in-principle application on site which has been included in the local development plan for housing?
Of course, you would, proper competent reasons would have to be articulated to refuse it, but you would have to have a very strong regard to the fact it is zoned, and it is since it has gone through the LDP process, it's been zoned, it's already been assessed for housing. What the IPM is doing in principle is adding details and also, been recommended for conditions. So to refuse on the basis, you have to come up with competent reasons, but it is difficult as much as I would want. As far as we want to go, that would be very difficult.
Yeah, I think on your first question, the definition of committed is quite well articulated in the papers, and it means that construction has actually commenced. And that is articulated in the paper. Yes, started on site. That's my understanding of what's written there. Councillor Drysdale.
Thank you, Convener. Throughout the presentations this afternoon and this morning, there has been clear frustration from several members of committee and from several other speakers about the nature of the process here, as opposed to the merits or otherwise of the application. And indeed, I sense from the applicant himself, Mr. Stephen, that, and I perhaps should have asked the question of him, but I sense that he shares the frustration at the length of the process as well. In terms of the policy matters which may give rise to a decision to either approve or refuse this application, can I ask for clarification and comment in terms of TAPLAN as opposed to the local development plan? In terms of TAPLAN policy 2, shaping better quality places, I shall just paraphrase this particular policy, but basically the policy seeks to ensure the integration of transport and land uses. It seems to me that what we have here is a plan for land use and a plan for a transport infrastructure improvement, but potentially, hearing what Mr. Stephen says about the planned schedule of actual build, but potentially a minimum of 3 years between the completion of the Crosstay Link Road and the start of meaningful development on site. So with that minimum 3-year time difference, how can it be asserted that that the policy of ensuring integration of transport and land uses has been followed?
I'm minded to let my colleagues answer that rather than try and answer it myself, because I could, but I'll let Peter Marshall deal with it.
I would say that the local development plan that we prepared and adopted in 2014 was probably at the forefront in terms of Scottish examples in actually integrating the transport planning and the land use planning. Fundamental to the strategy was the traffic modelling, which assessed the implications of all of the proposals within the plan, together with an estimate in terms of the stuff that comes forward in conversions, what we call windfall applications. So that was fully modelled. What the plan does is link the two by having the embargo that we've heard referred to try and ensure that the rate of development coming forward in the key corridors, which were the A85 and the A93 and 94 areas, would be linked to the development of the Crosstay Link Road, phase 1, which is underway at the moment. So all of that was taken into account. The whole issue of whether any houses are allowed in advance of it becoming a committed project or a completely constructed project was determined by the reporter. There were objections from two fronts. There were something just short of 40 objections from members of the public in the Scone area, which related to objections to the principle of the site being there and the potential for any construction or development in that area before the Crosstay Link Road was completed. There were objections from the developer to the imposition of the embargo, and not just from the developer before you today, from other developers. The reporter into the local development plan considered all of these objections and chose to recommend to the council that 100 houses in this case be allowed in advance of the Crosstay Link Road becoming a committed project. I would say that it's now anticipated with what I would call a pessimistic project plan, and I say pessimistic because it's assuming the longest potential time frame for a compulsory purchase inquiry, the likes of that. But the anticipated committed date with construction starting on site is in mid 2019, with a construction period of something just short of 2 years. So the date that Alex Deans gave you of the completion in early 2021 is accurate. So these issues have been considered by the inquiry reporter, who made the recommendations that we allow 100 houses in advance of the becoming a committed project. It was legally incumbent on the council to accept these figures, these modifications. One of the reporter's reasoning for this was that Scone has one of the best public transport links into Perth, with a 10-minute bus service at most times of the day, the number 7 bus. He took that into account as a factor. Another example of where, in preparing the local development plan, we've looked to where the best public transport links are or where they can be improved in the future. So I would say there is that connection between the transport planning and the development plan system.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Marshall. Mr. Carricker, in his deputation, previously quoted from the local development plan, page 141. I would ask to note the top of page 142, which states that there's 100 houses permitted before the Cross-Tay Link Road is committed. And that is quoted in the local development plan, which was determined by the reporter 2014, just for clarification. Are there any further questions? Councillor Jarvis.
Yes, it's with regards to the local development plan. I mean, in exceptional circumstances, we can change it slightly. And I really don't think it's right that the reporter comes through and overturns what is the settled will, aspiration of the council, of the fact that the link road had to be committed before these 100 houses were built. I mean, we have an extenuating circumstance in the effect it has with the pollution at Bridgend, and you don't need to live in Scone or Bridgend to see the traffic there is appalling. So, I mean, we can therefore just amend that portion of the plan and not accept what the reporter said, that the 100 houses could be built in advance of the road becoming a committed project in the interest of the health of some vulnerable people within our communities, e.g. children and residents.
Thank you for the question. Would anyone like to respond to that? Mr. Marshall.
The issue of having to accept the reporter's recommendations is a contentious one. It's acknowledged in the review of the planning system, which is ongoing. But I'm afraid the law, as it stands at the moment, does not allow the council to ignore the reporter's recommendations, with very few exceptions. None of these applied in this case. One is if it is going to damage a European designated site and the reporter hasn't taken account of that. Another, for example, is if it is contrary to national planning policy. These are all matters which a reporter takes account of in his examination process. So it's extremely unlikely that any circumstances come forward where a council, and not just Perth and Kinross Council, has the opportunity to go against the reporter's recommendations. We cannot change the development plan. It is as approved. It's only through the review of the development plan process that changes can be made. There is no provision for interim changes. Under the old legislative system, there used to be a provision for what they called alterations to development plans. That doesn't exist at the moment.
Councillor James.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, like most councillors have said today, I mean, we really have been put in a position here, and I'm quite angry about that, if I'm honest, although I have worked or served on a planning committee elsewhere. I'm very, very conscious that this is a quasi-judicial committee, and therefore we can only look at planning issues. But looking at this, there are 101 moral issues, and that's something we're not allowed to take into account. However, from a procedural point of view, there's an awful lot of potentials and maybes and what have you, which we're being asked to give our consent to. But I'm looking at page 114 of our papers, procedural note, and it says consent shall not be issued until a section 75 agreement relating to planning contributions has been completed. And it goes on then to say it can, if that's not dealt with in 4 months, that can be recommended for refusal under delegated powers. My question is, why wasn't this negotiated before it came to us? If we were short, if we're running over time already, why wasn't this dealt with by the previous planning committee as well? So 2 questions. Why wasn't it dealt with by the previous planning committee, and why wasn't this sorted before it came to us for consent?
Sorry, this is the first time this application has come to a committee, other than it came to full council as part of the local development plan. The other parts of the question someone else might wish to answer.
In terms of your specific point about why wasn't the Section 75 resolved prior to this application coming before committee, and the simple answer to that is that it's only when a decision is made on an application that it then triggers the need for the Section 75 agreement. So obviously a legal agreement requires both parties to sign up to that, and therefore for an applicant to sign up to Section 75 legal agreement requiring certain contributions as is set out in this paper, then the applicant has to be very clear what those requirements are. And it's something which therefore ties in with the granting of a consent rather than the other way round, because that would be seen as, if we were to agree a Section 75, that would be prejudging the outcome of the planning application. So it's in that order that it's done.
Councillor Wilson.
Thanks, Convener. 4 quick points. Convener, it was my intention at this stage, I think, or before this stage, to suggest that we have a site visit and a deferral, but perhaps just for the benefit of members of the public, would Mr Elliott like to outline briefly the consequences of us making that decision?
Thank you. Mr Elliott.
Thank you, Convener. I think at this stage, of course, I think this is a question rather than a motion at the moment, so we're not yet at that stage. In terms of a site visit, bear with me. The first aspect of that, if this has been considered for members to consider, would be what would the purpose of the site visit be? What are you going to gain out of going on the site that you don't already have through the stills and all the reports and all the expert comments? You have to think, bearing in mind this is an in-principle application, you wouldn't be going to view heights of buildings, potential buildings, etc., because that's not in view at the moment. Now, you've also, one of the consequences will be, you have heard from Mr Stephen, it would be his intention to appeal against non-determination. So it would take out your hands, the appeal would go to the reporters unit, to the DPA, and it would be dealt with through there. You would also have to think about, and if you do wish to defer for a site visit, whether that's accompanied or unaccompanied. Accompanied would be accompanied by applicant and objectors. Unaccompanied would be officers and members. Now, I will stress that a site visit is not about discussing the merits in any shape or form. It is there to view aspects of the site in and out of the site. Also, in terms of a site visit, would that be an optional site visit for members, or would it be a requirement for all to go? Now, the second is more obvious. And the consequence of that is also, when it comes back to the next meeting, it would only be the members who are sitting here and have gone on the site visit and then attend the second meeting would be the ones entitled to vote and determine the application. It may well be, certainly practice in the past, we don't have many site visits, practice in the past is you wouldn't go back to the beginning again. You wouldn't hear submissions again.
Convener, thank you for that response. I wanted to tease that out a little bit because I think it's quite important for those folk who are in the room in the vicinity, who are not as used to some of the planning issues as some of us are, to understand the situation in regard to if we defer for any reason today, then the applicant will appeal and it will be in the hands of a reporter. And this committee will have no influence in that process at all. And if I might say, the detailed conditions that are within this report might or might not be included in any reporter's recommendations.
The very point I was about to make.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. Mr. Stephen gave a timetable in his presentation. Would the planning officers like to comment on that in terms of planning, not because you're planners, not builders? Is it being realistic, optimistic, or whatever in relation to, I think, the first occupied house would be at the end of 2018 of the 100, and thereafter a completion rate of at the most 25, and Bulgarvey was mentioned as a 17, I think, per year rate. Have the planners any comment on that, please?
Okay, thank you. Mr. Bryant?
Yes, Convener, Councillor Wilson, you can't. I don't think anyone would be in a position to give an exact date about when houses may or may not be started and occupied. I think what the timetable put forward by the applicant was realistic, in my opinion. If the outcome of this application is an approval, then the applicant still has to come back with, has to work up the detailed submission to get a detailed consent. And there are other consents which you referred to, such as road construction consent and various issues relating to statutory operators as well, which you'd have to satisfy. And then you have to build out. Now, given if the consent was granted on the basis of the recommendation today, and I think the build rate suggested by the applicant is probably a reasonable ballpark figure in terms of the likely rate the current market would sustain, and that would give a 4-year build period just for the 100 units. I think what we have to also look at is that the build rate for houses will clearly depend, firstly, on the market for those houses, but secondly, what are the other competing sites? And it's quite likely that over that timescale there will be other competing sites in and around Perth which will be vying for a similar market, and therefore that will impact on the rate of build. So I would say that the timetable put forward by the applicant would not be far off the mark.
Thank you. My third question, Convener, is in relation to this contentious issue which is contained on page 111, and it's proposed condition 25 about the 100 residential units. Am I right in thinking, Convener, in layman's terms, we are stuck with that?
If you refer to the local development plan, top of page 142, the reporter states 100 units before the project for the Cross Trail road link is committed.
Okay, so in common parlance, we're stuck with it. Thank you. You'll be pleased to know, despite it might stick in a lot of people's craw.
Absolutely.
My fourth and last one, you'll be pleased to know, Convener, is in relation to the rate of build of the rest of the site apart from the 100, right? Is it within the competence of this committee to consider how that might be handled?
I suspect it is, but I would ask colleagues to give some indication.
Yes, we have, if you turn to condition 3 on the report, which is on page 102, that condition requires a detailed phasing and delivery plan to be submitted. And obviously that would have to be agreed with the through officers in terms of the subsequent phases.
Have we any other questions for officers at this point? Okay. I'll just say that this is an important site, an important opportunity development site for housing in Perth, and I would ask for a motion, please, at this point. Councillor Drysdale.
Yes, Convener, I would, having listened to the arguments on every side today on what is an emotive and very complicated matter, it seems to me that what I've referred to already as the process issues that have constrained us and have affected our ability to reach a settled view today. On balance, whilst appreciating the difficulties that, if approved, this would potentially cause to the process and to the builder, I come back to what I said earlier, that there are new councillors on here who less than 24 hours ago completed the second phase of training.
I have to ask, is this a motion?
Yes. And it was indicated at that training that best practice was a site visit. In order to better understand the potential impact of this application on the area in general, I would wish to propose a deferral of the decision to allow all committee members present here today to visit the proposed location.
Thank you for that. I would only qualify that by saying I wasn't aware, having attended that session, that it was recommended that a site visit was the best option. That's certainly what I heard. That may be your interpretation, but it certainly wasn't mine, Councillor. Do we have a seconder? Councillor Barnacle.
Yes, I will second that motion because I feel that it's appropriate, given the size of the application, some of the issues that have been raised by the speakers and members of the committee. And I don't think, at the end of the day, it can be anything other than an aid to the correct decision in due course. So, in terms of the timescale, I'm not convinced by the threat from the applicant. I believe it is good practice, in this instance, to proceed with a site visit.
Thank you. Listen to that carefully. Mr. Elliott may wish for clarification. Just on
Yes, Councillor Drysdale, I think we have to be clear. It's defer for... Now, are you intending an unaccompanied or an accompanied site visit? Unaccompanied would be normal practice, but it's not always the practice, and that would be officers and members,
yes,
not anyone else.
Yeah, I would prefer an unaccompanied visit, provided it was accompanied by officers. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'll just ask Mr. Bryan to clarify the comment that he made at the training session.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I do recall that this issue had been raised on both training sessions in terms of a site visit, and I was quite clear. I said that it was recommended that councillors visit all the sites that are on the planning committee agenda, but I was asked a specific question about was it routine for organised site visits, and I said that it wasn't. But I said it was best practice to visit the site, but I never said it was best practice to visit as a committee.
I accept that.
Thank you. Can we have an amendment if there is one?
Councillor Convener, could I just step in? I want to... The motion would be defer for an unaccompanied site visit for all committee members present to attend. And I just want to be clear that if that means all, it's required. And when it comes back should it come back second time, and it can only be those who have been here today, gone on site visit, and then come back. There wouldn't be more submissions. It would just be straight down into determining.
I absolutely accept that, yes.
Just want to be clear on that.
And also that, therefore, presumably it would be quite possible to arrange that relatively quickly.
That will be a matter of democratic services, but it might be that instead of delaying or waiting until the next scheduled committee meeting, I'm sure it can be looked at as to whether there could be a special meeting earlier.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have an amendment? Councillor Wilson.
Sorry.
Or Councillor Band, sorry, point of order.
I do have an amendment, but my amendment is not to approve. My amendment is to not have the deferment for a decision to be made after it was decided whether it was to be a deferment and site visit or not a deferment and site visit, then make the decision rather than ask to approve the paper at the moment.
Councillor Band, at the moment we have a motion to defer. It's up to any other member to put forward an amendment. And if there is no amendment, then the motion would go through. So if you're thinking something different, it's not a case of voting yes or no against that motion. Procedure, as you've been familiar with before, is motion, amendment. So if you have an alternative, you put it forward now. And I think convener was actually asking for an amendment.
It would be a second amendment, I think, that could happen.
My concern is that I do not wish for this matter not to be decided today.
Right.
And I feel that what we have here is a non-determination, shall we say. Whereas I would like to see the decision made today, but not necessarily, again, Second Amendment, I suppose.
Yep, I think that the amendment, the motion is to defer, and
the consequences have been explained.
And the consequences with Councillor Band's amendment would be that we determine today.
Well,
and a second vote to
I understand
determine what that decision is.
But in determining today, you need to say what you want to determine. You're indicating grant or refuse. So it is a question of, you've got a deferral motion at the moment, and therefore the question for committee is there an alternative? Does someone, and by determining today, does someone want to grant or refuse?
Your proposed amendment, your proposed amendment that we determine it today isn't competent in its own right. It would have to be accompanied by a move for approval or a move for refusal on the day.
My concern with that situation is there may be some who would wish to support or reject the motion, the paper, but will be tied in having to vote on the deferment motion.
Convener, on a point of order, could I suggest an amendment?
Yep.
To get us out of the fix, and I understand Councillor Band's point, but I think procedurally it's difficult. I'm going to move an amendment to approve the application. I do so with what I can only describe, convener, as a heavy heart. I don't appreciate in any shape or form the developer coming to this committee and saying if they don't get a decision today, they will go to appeal, because I don't think that is in the least bit helpful. However, that we asked the question and we got a direct answer. My initial indication for today would have been to support a site visit. The risk of allowing a reporter to determine this is considerable. We already have the bruises of that process in the local development plan, convener, and have had to live with that. And I do not want to repeat that risk again. I think that the conditions that are outlined, and I very much commend the work of the action group in Scone and the Community Council in taking a huge interest in this application. I've never seen a community council and a community come together so much to look at an application in such an informed and detailed way, and I commend all that work. I also share an office with Councillor Lewis Simpson, and I assure you he keeps me up to date on a weekly, if not a daily basis, with the process. I have a detailed knowledge of the geography of Scone, not as detailed as some of the local members, but a detailed knowledge. And I think I've got a fairly detailed knowledge of the history of this. It's not a happy situation. However, the development is in the local development plan. We have a stark choice today, convener, and that is to allow an outsider with no background knowledge at all of the site and with no ability to influence them or ability to influence the conditions which might be set out in any reporter's recommendations. therefore, having thought about it long and hard, not just throughout this committee meeting today, but for the last few weeks and months, I move the approval with all of the conditions, and in the knowledge that we have had both from the developer and from the planners from different perspectives, a reasonably likely scenario of what the house building rate will be over the next 4 years. And that's going to be relatively small. I take the point from Professor Belch about the environment entirely. I totally agree. But the development rate will be relatively small. There'll be lots and lots of difficult ways ahead, lots of difficult and contentious issues to deal with. The conditions, in my opinion, cover these. But I would like to suggest that we add one additional condition, and perhaps if I could, if the clerk could take that piece of paper so you could read it. I've managed to scribble something out. And I'll read this out. I'll read this out carefully so that folk have got the chance to absorb it. It's in relation, obviously, to the application before us for Scone North. Following the Cross Tay Road link becoming a committed project as defined under condition 25 of this consent, and you'll find that condition outlined on page 111. Following the Cross Tay link becoming a committed project as defined under condition 25 of this consent, no more than 67 residential units, in addition to those permitted under condition 25, i.e. that's the 100 that we're, as I said earlier on, convener, stuck with, shall be permitted to be occupied until the Cross Tay Road link is completed, and I emphasise the word completed, so that, and that would mean, I think, cumulatively, conscious convener, I once failed O-level arithmetic at school, but that would mean the maximum number of completed units would be 167 prior to the CTLR being completed, and therefore I move that motion.
Yep, just for
Sorry, that amendment, I beg your pardon.
That's an amendment, yep. Now, do we have a seconder for that amendment? I would start. We have Councillor Coates, just
I will
beat you to it, Councillor James.
I will second Councillor Wilson's amendment with pleasure.
Sorry, Convener, just
the amendment is competent.
Yes, Convener, just one clarification for Councillor Wilson and Councillor Coates. The planning officer suggested a slight change in condition 1, which is page 102. It was the same with the previous application as well, changing the word regulations 2008 to 2013. It's a technical change. Are you content with that?
I'm content with that. It's obviously acceptable.
We have a motion, we have an amendment. Do we have a second amendment?
No, I don't have a second amendment. Can I have a point of order, convener? Yep. Especially because we have new councillors here. I'm quite upset that there was a pre-printed amendment given to the committee, because the whole purpose of this is to listen to all the productions given and make your mind up on the day. This seems to have been something that was printed out prior to this to give to the officers, and I'm very uncomfortable with that.
Okay, I accept your discomfort. I think as far as the amendment is concerned, it is competent, and therefore we are obliged to accept it.
Could I comment on that, please, on a point of order? I did take the precaution of asking if such wording would be competent before presenting it to the committee, because I think it is open to members to ask about competency issues prior to that.
Thank you very much. So, given that we have a motion and we have an amendment, if Mr. Elliott would like to articulate both the mover of the motion has the opportunity to sum up before we go to a vote. But, yeah, if you'd like to do any summing up.
Very briefly, I would just like to say that I understand the complications of the process. I've said that already. I understand the desire to keep the decision local, albeit what we're looking at today is constrained by previous decisions at a national level. Nevertheless, we are in a position here where we are looking at, we've listened to deputations from various people, and for me, the health of our community is paramount and must outweigh every other consideration. And I don't believe that the health issues identified have been properly addressed, and therefore I wish to fully understand that by visiting the site and understanding the surrounding areas before reaching my decision.
Members, before we go on to the vote, I'd just like to remind you what the motion and amendment are. The motion by Councillor Drysdale, second by Councillor Barnacle, is to defer for an unaccompanied site visit for all committee members to visit and also bring back to a future meeting of the committee. The amendment by Councillor Wilson, seconded by Councillor Coates, is to approve the application in terms of the report with an amended condition 1 and the additional condition that's been outlined. So motion is defer, amendment is to grant.
Councillors, in terms of Standing Order 44, the voting is by roll call. So when I call out your name, could you please tell me whether you're voting for the motion or for the amendment? Councillor Lyle.
Amendment.
Councillor Braun.
Amendment.
Councillor Anderson.
Motion.
Councillor Band.
Amendment.
Councillor Barnacle.
Motion.
Councillor Coates.
Amendment.
Councillor Drysdale.
Motion.
Councillor James.
Amendment.
Councillor Jarvis.
Amendment.
Councillor McCall.
Amendment.
And Councillor Wilson.
Members, that was 3 in favour of the motion to defer, 8 in favour of the amendment to grant. Therefore, the amendment to grant carries.
Thank you very much. The application is approved. I would ask, are there any further comments that any members wish to make regarding this? We have none, so, Councillor Band.
I'm still concerned with the situation of our standing orders. I know it's not appropriate for this committee, but I can bring it up here, that we have a situation with someone who has moved for a deferment, may have wanted to approve the paper, may have wanted to reject the paper, but not given that opportunity since they'd moved to deferment. It's not merely a comment that you asked for.
I'll take on board your concerns, and I will try to find an answer for you as quickly as possible. Thank you very much. I would now suggest that we adjourn for lunch and we reconvene at 2:15.